building.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to be refuting the claim of fact that polygraph tests are unreliable and their findings are often invalid. The first point was that polygraph tests measure bodily functions while an administrator asks questions, though these functions are not unique to lying. According to former CIA officers and co-authors of the book Spy the Lie, Philip Houston, Michael Floyd, and Susan Carcinero, there are physical ways to tell if someone is lying. While you can argue that your hands sweat when you're nervous, and of course you would probably sweat the whole time during a polygraph test, administrators would not convict anybody for a crime just because of your hands being sweaty. A polygraph test will take all of the signs that a person is lying, not just one, and compile them into a definitive answer. A polygraph test measures small, sometimes physically unnoticeable responses. There is a good example of the type of questions used in a polygraph test in an article from the American Psychological Association. They describe a scenario as if the administrator was attempting to find out if somebody is guilty or not in a robbery. Instead of saying, "Did you rob the bank?" which is a question that would make anybody nervous, they ask how much was stolen, $500, $1,000, or $5,000. The person in question would show a small physiological response to the amount of money that was actually stolen if they are guilty, because they would know how much money if they were the ones who robbed them. The second point was that polygraphs can be misused and utilized to the advantage of administrators to gain results, which is separate from actual validity of results. There are corrupt people in the world. Some of the administrators of polygraph tests, of course, have twisted the results to fit their own motives to find that person guilty or innocent. This also happens in courtrooms. Innocent people are convicted of crimes that they did not commit because our justice system, one could argue, is flawed. Just like guilty people slip through the cracks and are set free due to problems with evidence or somebody's testimony. Of course, that doesn't mean that we change our justice system completely. It means we have to be sure that there's enough evidence and findings to back up the finding of guilty or innocent. I'll use the example of the robbery again. If the person in question has a small physiological reaction to the amount of $1,000 and that was the amount that was stolen, the administrator would continue asking more questions to verify that that person is in fact guilty. They would not stop the test and consider them guilty. This would just be one of many questions asked. In a real-life situation, this person would also go to court, and there would have to be actual evidence to put them away in jail. According to Issues in Science and Technology, and an article written in 2003 about the use of polygraph tests, one of the most common uses now is for released sex offenders to have to submit to recurring polygraph tests while on probation. If the test shows that that person has done something wrong while on probation, it could send police into an investigation, but this person would not immediately go to jail and have their life ruined. They were already convicted and are just being watched to be sure they don't commit another crime. This is a great example of a way in which the polygraph test should and is being used. The third point that he made was that countermeasures have potential to undermine the utility of screenings. For some, passing a polygraph test by lying can be done. For example, at the beginning of the test, the administrator will ask a series of normal questions that will not make you nervous. The idea is that if you're innocent, you'll respond to all of the questions with the same calmness, and the polygraph will never say you're lying. If you can manipulate your body into seeming nervous during the preliminary questions, you can trick the polygraph when it comes to the actual interrogation. This is considered a countermeasure, and while it's possible, it's not easy. As I mentioned before, there are obvious signs when someone is lying, and trying to stop the involuntary ones, such as your hands sweating, is very difficult for most everybody. It is even more difficult to make yourself seem nervous for the easy questions and keep the same face when you get to the actual questions. For this reason, countermeasures are of course a problem, but not a reason to say that polygraphs are unreliable. I've gone over why the polygraph is reliable and that the invalid results mentioned are not easy to achieve. Polygraphs are a tool used mostly by the government for interrogation and not a tool that would be able to put you in jail. They are good for getting preliminary evidence in a case, but are not used as admissible evidence in court.
say love money is a Patriots win. We're talking about that.
All right. You follow the structure pretty clearly. I like that. I thought that you offered good, you guys, I thought that you offered pretty good,
Be a hater.
I think you offered some pretty good evidence on some of those individual points. Examples about how the questions are administered, kind of explaining what the baseline information is in the questioning process. The accuracy of the polygraph is, I don't remember that the advocate had any statistical information indicate the frequency with which mistakes are made, and I didn't hear any information from you that talked about any statistic that matches or demonstrates the accuracy of the polygraph. We just get kind of the general theory about how it works, and if there was some convincing information, like if there had been a study that found that 98% of the time they could detect honest information or something like that.
Not a whole lot, just because a lot of the polygraphs
Yeah.
are used under wraps. Like it's not
Well,
really something that people
Well, I know it's used under wraps, but to study a polygraph, the American Psychological Association could put 3 people in a room, ask them a series of questions, and record those results. They don't need to have the results from an actual polygraph that was administered by the CIA. They can do it to test subject. Somebody has done this kind of research. I mean, I've seen it before, so that's why I'm saying what you need is some of that kind of information here to back up your argument. I think you've got a good explanation about why a polygraph is likely to be accurate. What you're missing is the final punch that says, and here's some evidence that shows how accurate it is, and the advocate had no information to suggest how inaccurate it is. They just raised a couple of questions that I've already answered. And so what you need is that extra push to respond back to that particular point. The idea that it's misused, I think you've got a good response on that, and that is that it's, any information can be misused. This is not the fault of the polygraph. That is the fault of the administrator or the people who are conducting the tests. And you do some comparative stuff about trials and that sort of thing. I don't remember if the advocate specified particular places where it gets misused. There might also be, for instance, legal ramifications when it comes to that. You do mention at the end, for instance, that you can't use a polygraph in a courtroom, but you can use polygraphs in other circumstances. And the example that you give of people who are on parole or probation and monitoring them suggests that misuse seems like it's less likely to occur there. It is simply kind of a procedural thing. I think probably what the advocate's talking about when it comes to misuse is either manipulating the data on employment issues or like security screenings and those kinds of things. But I think one of the things that you could point out is that it was a little bit vague as to what they were talking about when it comes to misuse, and that you've got an answer that says, well, it can't be misused in a court because it's not acceptable in court. You always have to have other evidence to make a decision in a criminal case like that. So, the harm from this is not particularly significant. I think you kind of make that argument on the last point, but I think it applies to this point also. And then, like I said, I think the lack of specificity about what the misuse was might have been a point to raise a little bit more. And then, like we got to that last point where we were talking about how is it really actually being used, and you go back to talking about how you can't, it's difficult to have the countermeasures. You kind of explain why that would be the case. And I think we're kind of in the same territory where the advocate was, where they're given their explanations and reasons, and you're giving your explanations and reasons, and it's just a little bit, this is where we need some data, and I'm not sure that anybody presented any data that was convincing on that one way or the other. All right, thank you.